Hi, I'm Vivian Schiller. I'm the Executive Director of Aspen Digital, a program of the Aspen Institute. Thanks for joining us today. This session is part of a series of briefings on mis and disinformation that we're hosting here at the Aspen Institute in tandem with our Commission on Information Disorder. We're talking to a series of top experts in the field who can help us make sense of all the various facets of the information crisis we're experiencing. We're designing this as a resource for our commissioners and also making it available to you, the broader public. We hope you find this series, which we're calling Disinfo Discussions, useful and informative. In this episode, I am so fortunate to be speaking with Danah Boyd. She is a partner researcher at Microsoft Research, the founder and president of Data and Society, and a visiting professor at New York University. That is a lot of roles, Danah. Welcome.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Yeah, good. But also all of those roles makes you a perfect person for our topic today, which is really something of a mis and disinformation 101. So the thing that I always struggle with when I talk to people about the topic is when we talk about mis and disinformation, we're really talking about a really broad range of issues. So just to get us started, give us a bit of an overview on what are the dynamics and dimensions when we talk about information disorder and mis and disinformation.
No, absolutely. And it's great to be here today. Mis and disinformation keeps shape shifting. So it's meant different things at different times. And so you're totally fair game to not actually know how to define it, because I don't think anybody does. And I think that's part of the point. And so the dimensionality of it is not one where it's like, oh, we've all agreed that these are the dimensions. It's more that that term is getting pulled and included to refer to a bunch of things. So many ways the term came on the landscape of the current set of conversations following the 2016 US election. And in that particular context, it really was trying to locate a practice of nefarious, malintended content to really undermine a political process. So this was, what pejoratively and problematically got called fake news in different ways that of course that changed itself in a term, but it was really trying to say like, hey, there's this content that is actually misleading, but usually for a purpose of harm. And this is where of course you start to see the separation between disinformation, which really locates that, and misinformation, which are all the different ways in which people shared content because they thought they were being helpful and they're trying to make sense of things. And that lives with us today in a lot of political contexts, even for things that may not be about partisan politics. So things like, for example, COVID. When we're thinking about vaccination efforts at this point, we have this whole question of what is content that's really nefarious, trying to undermine an attempt to do vaccination work, and what is people just trying to make sense of information because they can't make heads or tails of what's going on. And they are in effect spreading rumors and gossip, et cetera. And it's notable, I point out vaccination, not just because of the COVID dynamics of the present, but vaccination and anti-vaxxing content is a place where, researchers have been seeing questions of what we now call disinformation long before that, but it wasn't referred to under the same terms. And that's where you start to then say, okay, so what are the set of actors and what are their malintentions? And that's where one branch of people who talk about disinfo go into this question of like, okay, well, we can talk about foreign state actors and their various, ideas of power, political power and control. You can talk about within state partisan actors and the different activities that they do. You can talk about economic actors, people who are making money off of different kinds of coordination. You can also talk about aspects of ideology or particular philosophies of the world. Well, once people start talking about that, they also then take another turn, because this is this question of, okay, let's take an economic turn for a moment. There's a long history of people playing games for economic gain. That's usually called marketing, right? Or branding. So where's the line between something that is, seen as legitimate or something that's seen as nefarious, even within an economic condition? This even when we start to see the intersection with technology, because not everybody talks about it as an intersection with technology, but some people do. When we intersect with technology, we've got another set of questions, right? Like with search engine optimization, which has been with us for 20 years, is that a coordinated effort for information disorder or disinformation activity? What about it when it's a brand activity? So how do we start to tease it out? So that is one way of going about it. The other thing is that when you take another set of actors, you will also see different questions, especially in that ideological space. So I'm operating in the United States, we're living in the United States, where our caste system has been rooted in our original sin having to do with race and the way that we treat race in the United States. That has always been flush with not just malintended information and not just economically motivated information. So like one of those like fun factoids is one of the core roots of advertising in newspapers is actually rooted in the selling of slaves, right? Which is where you see the economic hate orientation, but of course all of the other politicized orientations around hate. And hate is another one of those trajectories. Once we start looking at this through hate, you end up with a way well history. And that's also where you start to question different ideas of what's been the role of news in countering that and in propagating it, right? The news ecosystem was in many ways for the longest time what would uphold and propagate the KKK in the United States. So depending on these moments, you start to then go down different trajectories. And that's why when I start to think about it, it's like, okay, what categories of content or information are we concerned about? Who's controlling that? For what kinds of ideological purposes? How are they using the different tools that are around them to achieve that? And that's why this is such a hairball that touches on so many different sectors and so many different communities.
Wow. So that is a lot. I would love it if we could just try to unpack a few of those. I realize that, truly unpacking them, we would be together for weeks on end, but just to sort of try to take that, like you said, that big hairball of stuff and break it down a little bit further. Maybe we can spend a couple of minutes on something you mentioned about earlier about sort of who are the actors. You mentioned foreign actors, in-state actors, which I assume you mean are domestic actors, economic actors, ideology, and of course, pervading a lot of this are issues around race. And then after that, maybe we can move on to talking about, just to sort of set the stage, talk about the vectors through which this kind of misinformation travels, how and through what. How does that sound?
Sure, happy to go there.
So let's take a step back. Foreign, domestic, economically motivated, ideologically motivated. Can you just say a little bit about the state of play for each of those?
I mean, and be honest, the state of play for each of those is also shape shifting, right?
Yeah.
So, geopolitics, I'll start with the foreign, which is at this big macro level. Geopolitics has always been a site of contestation, right? How, as a state, do you control what the polis knows and control what the other state knows when you're thinking about it in a competitive or warfare type context? And this is where, of course, we see those roots into the notion of propaganda and the idea of propaganda really getting labeled and understood. I mean, like, originally propaganda was about business and marketing, ends up getting taken up in Europe, of course, as we would lead first to World War I, but more significantly with World War II. After World War II, pretty much everybody around the world was seeing propaganda and information warfare as a thing to engage in, to resist, to challenge. That also has shapeshift, right? There were times where this involved the dropping of, flyers into a population as a way of shaping their perception about the world. Now, this mostly happens in a mediated form, sometimes in a visible form, sometimes not. But it's this question of how can you shape what a population believes? That, of course, becomes particularly concerning in a democratic, context, because democracy really depends on an informed citizenry. Like, those are seen as connected. So if a foreign state actor can really upend the knowledge scape of a particular sphere, then can democracy actually function, right? And that's all of these contestations that play out. And it's also a question of like what it means to try to use democracy as a propaganda tool, right? Which is the United States has been critiqued about forever. So this is all, that's like an example of where that landscape goes. And I would say that when you're dealing with foreign actors in this current context, to your point of like, where is it now? it's everything is shifting with the new technologies, right? So new technologies means that we're dealing with more communications through different, it's more fragmented right now. It's within smaller groups. We've gone away from it really being about the public web into much more micro community stuff. That's probably the biggest shift of the present. Now, when it comes to within a state, and I'll use a democracy kind of state for an example here.
You can use the United States.
We'll use the United States. Right? We have seen partisan conflict between our elected officials since the beginning, right? And this, there's often these sort of jokes about different things that were rumors that were spread, and they were usually referred to as rumors that were spread about people who were running for office. That has been, again, a thing. And so what's also interesting when we talk about the 20th century is that our elected officials started taking to the various media, right? Giving radio talks, then giving TV presentations. And this is the story of media's relationship with our elected process. Unsurprisingly, it came to the internet, like, let's use the internet. So Al Gore may not have invented the internet, but they certainly used the internet to try to actually communicate both policy and empathy and a variety of other feelings. Well, it also means that you get nasty tactical games between partisan actors. And this is where you also have to deal with where there are economic interests. So that's where there's an economic that's by itself, and then there's the economic that's tethered to domestic politics. So an example of that is some of the things that we saw in the ways of doing information framing. So an example from this is in the 90s, there was a very well-known Republican political operative by the name of Frank Luntz. And his tactics were really fascinating because he would do these pollings for people in the 90s. He would bring lots of people together and be like, let's understand different things and try to figure out terms of phrases that would actually work with different groups. He would test these, and then he would work with electeds, and these were Republican electeds, in order to make that the drumbeat of their message to the media, because at that point the news was critical. So many of his terms. One of them most famously is climate change, which he coined because global warming was too scary, and so he worked to figure out that that was a better term, and he made that into a drumbeat. Now, that was to uphold an agenda that had economic interests, right? And there was a lot of big oil money behind that. This is where scholars talk about agnotology, which is the study of ignorance. And we usually think about ignorance as the things we don't yet know, but there's also ignorance that is forgotten knowledge and ignorance that is purposefully manufactured. And so climate change is usually referred to as something where there was purposeful doubting in the science. People manufactured scientific reports to just ask questions and to create false equivalencies, to undermine the legitimacy of the conversation around climate. This was in the 90s, and that then created the opportunity for that term to become a political bludgeon, which is what it did. Now, fast forward, 30 years, and what we have from those days is that you don't need to do the polling work that Luntz did. People are testing that out on the internet all the time. They're trying out terms, they're trying out phrases, and those phrases are getting picked up for political purposes and economic purposes. And so you see those entanglements all over the place there. And they're also, of course, hate ideological, and we can come back to some of that. In terms of hate and ideology, and different kinds of ideological spectra that's going on right now, in many ways, hate has actually been a leading indicator on a lot of internet activity. People often think of these like glorious days of Usenet, where like people came together and just talked about code, but actually, Jesse Daniels has done a great amount of work. It's like the white nationalists were there from day one. They've been very sophisticated in using technology to uphold racist ideologies. And the way that I like to think about this is through the work of Michelle Alexander. And she's argued that if you think about the history of race-based hatred in the United States and the way in which it becomes infrastructure, you talk about the original sin, which is slavery, but she argues that as the country was dismantling slavery, it was rebuilding the next instantiation of the same thing, which we call Jim Crow. As Jim Crow was being dismantled, the next phase was being built back up, and that phase is understood as mass incarceration. Well, we are living through a moment where mass incarceration is being challenged, and a next phase is being pulled up, and this is where Ruha Benjamin will talk about it as the new Jim Code. So the ideas of using algorithms and data as a form of this. So you have this moment in which hate-based ideologies and just straight up hate speech on social media are also entangled with algorithmic systems that are being socialized and built into as tools of oppression. And there's, great scholarship, on those components of it, but it's this interesting moment as these things also rub up against each other, and you see it through the notions of what content moderation are. So what you're seeing here is that in each one of these things, when you start to go down, there's different pieces that connect it to other components that we know, and that historicization allows us to anchor what we're seeing, to see how certain things are shape-shifting, and give us opportunities to realize that this is not going to be about finding a fix. This is going to be about taking more of what we would think of as a security mindset, which is that if you've got systems that are adversarial, and I would argue that the very system of white supremacy is adversarial. If you've got systems that are adversarial, you have to watch as they shape shift, and you have to plan and move around that. So whenever people are like, oh, there's a fixed disinformation, it's like, no. There's ways of mediating, moderating, trying to move around it, trying to prevent it from growing in different ways. But we are seeing a moment, and we've lived through the last couple of years, where people didn't quite know how to. They just wanted to come and just build the next fix. Like the solutionism was hardcore. And I think part of the goal of the commission and part of the opportunity here is saying, okay, it's not that we're going to be living with disinformation, but we need to acknowledge that this is not something that can simply be fixed. It's something that we have to work our way through and around. And that means making sense of all of these different tentacles.
Right. So if we accept the fact that this is that mis and disinformation is constantly shape-shifting, if we accept that it is not one thing, but it is a Gordian knot of many dynamics, many motivations, whether they're foreign, domestic, ideological, economic, fundamentally racist, we accept all of that. Where do we go? You said, you used the words moderation and mediation. Let's move into a conversation about what are those levers? What are those moderation, mediation levers that we as a society, at least focusing on the United States for the time being, that we have at our disposal, whether it is government legislation or regulation, whether it is something that the platforms can do change voluntarily, or other parts of the private sector or civil society. So where do you see that?
No, absolutely. So part of it for me is trying to see, whenever you're dealing with a systems problem, understand that you're going to be chewing off a part of it, trying to do experiments, trying to do an intervention, seeing what works, seeing how things shift. Like that is part of it, rather than saying you're going to put something down and be done with it. So let's just take the platforms as an example here. The platforms are tools of amplification, and they were designed with the idea that, like, oh, anybody should be able to come and speak, right? Which is a classic tech logic, which is like, we'll design for all of the good uses and not at all prepare for the things that will actually go bad. Like that is so classically tech. And so there's this interesting moment within those design systems of like, okay, how do we cope with this? So I take the amplification piece seriously in this. And it's like, what does it mean to separate out the right to speak and the right to be amplified? Because when we talk about platforms, they often combine the two as though they're synonymous. But actually, it is the algorithmic systems that are in the control of the technical processes that chooses what could be amplified, right? And that is a choice of how those systems are designed, is a choice of saying, this is what our values are. And that's where, for me, one of the hardest things is that, capitalist enterprises, like the companies behind most of these versions of our platforms, actually have to grapple with values and governance, which is so outside of the realm of their understanding or frame of reference right now. And so I have to admit, there's a part of me that I'm just like sitting there waiting, because they're going to eventually realize that they're stuck doing this whether they want to or not. But I'm not saying that it's necessarily around the corner. And the reason why is that you start to get this question about how do you want to be complicit or not complicit in other people's projects? And right now, those companies are complicit in all sorts of nefarious folks' projects. And it's not just that this harms them reputationally and financially, but it also undermines the systems that have allowed them to prosper. So this is part of their own entanglements here. Now, why do I point out the right to amplification? Part of it is that you pointed out to law. Where does law come into this? And this is also about how do we interpret aspects of law, right? So this is, in the United States, we're obsessed with the idea of what First Amendment speech is. But First Amendment speech is not actually stable as a concept itself. From the moment of the constitutional, conventions and the discussions of this, that of course would lead into this amendment that we now know, there were a lot of debates about what that looked like. So part of it is also to think about how you follow the follow throughs in this. My favorite Supreme Court case that references this shows how our current read and the past reads aren't aligned always. So it was actually a Brandeis opinion where there was a case called Packer versus Utah. And in it, Packer was a tobacco company. And they argued that the Utah law that had at the time had outlawed tobacco advertisements on billboards, they argued that that was a violation of their First Amendment rights. Worked its way up to the Supreme Court. Supreme Court goes, no. That is not a violation of First Amendment at all, because First Amendment is not simply the right to speak. It is also about the right to listen in different ways. And that action of buying an ad on a billboard is something that Utah has the right to control, because the expectation is that, and love the old technologies, right? That the billboard would create a condition where somebody who wanted to be in public was forced to see this advertisement. And so it was a different thing to outlaw something like an advertisement in a magazine where you made choices about buying it, and something that would prohibit you from being in the public sphere without being exposed to this advertisement. Coming out of New York City, that's really funny to think about, right? I'd love to live in a world of Times Square that did not mean massive exposure, but that was sensible at the time. And really what that argument is about, the right to be amplified. So that's a moment where it's like, okay, well, what are our laws? Why do we get so stuck on First Amendment when we can say, like, what's the right to speak? What's the right to hear? What's the right to be amplified? How would we grapple with those things? The other thing that comes down to this has to do with intent or malintent, right? So one of the challenges, in Mexico, for example, is that they went through this period where it was illegal to post things on Twitter that were factually false. Well, who got ensnared in this, right? Of course, it wasn't people that were trying to produce factually false information. People were just like, did you hear this? What was that? How did that go, right? And so how do you understand how to mediate between that? And that's where you can see that the regulatory regime doesn't quite know how to do amplification in a sensible way. Then we have the question that often comes up with this with regard to what is the role of the news media in this? The news media have, of course, been given a privileged position with regard to speech in the United States. But that doesn't mean that they don't have some sort of moral responsibility. And that's, of course, been this interesting contestation over years. And of course, in the United States, we started by trying to think about what would be, fair airtime. That was a whole period, which of course we got undone. And that, where are the rights? And so we often go back to like the law, whether it's just about the law. But I often think that the law is not enough. We actually have to think about what the moral and cultural responsibilities are for an institution that gets privileged status in any way. And that's really hard to have in this conversation because people are like, but the money problem. And that's where we also have to account for, where does capitalism come into this? Because the other thing that has been shape-shifting alongside our information conversations is capitalism. Capitalism is also not one thing. The capitalism of the 50s is different than the capitalism of today for so many different reasons. But I often like to highlight this with regard to the news media, right? One of the reasons why the news media were able to be self-sustaining and financially sound in some ways through most of the 20th century was because of a couple of key factors. They didn't need to do late stage capitalism style return on investment, right, which requires just crazy growth processes. They also owned their own real estate, which was the one piece of wealth that kept growing over time. So the New York Times owned the New York Times building in the middle of Manhattan. Funny enough, in the 80s, of course, we would start to see that these become extremely valuable assets in a world where we see a whole financialization shift. And today, of course, if we look at the news media, they've lost access to their real estate, which have been turned into condos in most cities in the country. They've been totally captured by corporatized interests, whether we're talking hedge funds and private equity, et cetera. And so they have become complicit in a capitalism system where they're just like trying desperate for getting attention and validation and monetization. This does not create the conditions in which the news media is in a good position to ensure the information that will help the public be more informed. They're actually highly incentivized, whether we want to talk about it as clickbait or whether we don't talk about it like, fulfilling the particular interests of their demographic population. And that's what I'm saying. These are conditional issues. So we have to break different parts of this if we want to fix different parts of it, but we have to look at it as a systemic issue. I'd say one final piece to all of this, which has been sort of one of my obsessions with this. So if we think back about what it means to trust an institution, how do we trust an institution? It's interesting because in the US, that was a huge set of conversations after the Revolutionary War, leading into the creation of this thing we call the United States, complete with all of its flaws. And one of the big debates at the time was of course about what would it mean to trust government. And my favorite is the fact that George Washington, who was for all intents and purposes sort of seen as the next king, right, at that time, because they didn't really have a model for democracy, he decided to be silent during the Constitutional Convention, except once. He came in there and said, you know what? If you make it that people are represented in this country and that House of Representatives we're building, if you make it that they're represented with 1 out of every 40,000 people, nobody will ever trust the government. You need to make it 1 out of every 30,000 people. Of course, we're 1 out of every 720,000 people. So I often think about this of like, what kinds of connections do we have to have with systems to trust them? And with government, do we trust our representatives? We know that right now we're at an all-time low. If you don't know somebody in the military, do you trust the military? No. If you don't know a journalist and you have no local news organizations anymore, do you trust the field of journalism? No. If you don't know somebody that's building a tech company or connecting to tech, do you trust it? No. And that's where we have this challenge, which is that our actual social graph of the country is so fragmented that we also label things as misinformation whenever it comes from people, or disinformation, whenever it comes from people that are not part of our immediate 2-degree out network. And that's where there's another question to the fix. Can we reknit that graph of this country? Could we strategically find interventions? And that's where it's like, rather than focusing on the surface level condition that we're facing with this thing we call disinformation, can we get back to that infrastructural level? And for me, reknitting the country is an example of a much more infrastructural fix that can have such serious downstream impact. And that's why I often think about what's the role of social service, different kinds of public service activities. What's the role? I mean, the military was the hugest for most of the 20th century in reknitting. It's the key following the Civil War was to reknit through the military. The universities, which are crumbling, were often a key for knitting. How do we think about the knitting? Because I think that in many ways is going to be a much more effective systemic intervention to this downstream thing we call disinformation than even all of the things that focus on, say, the platforms or the higher level laws.
Well, it strikes me we're a long way from any kind of reknitting. In fact, where it feels like we're going in the wrong direction. How does that reknitting come about? What are the institutions through whom, with as you point out, levels of trust so low? People don't trust the media. People certainly don't trust politicians. They trust CEOs. Interestingly enough, they rank the highest of just about anyone in most surveys, although maybe perhaps not that high. So what is this? We'll move towards a close in a minute, but before we go to my final question, just sort of paint a picture for us of what that reknitting, what that might look like. So then we can think about, because we want to move towards solutions here, how we get to that place where we are not experiencing completely different evidence-based realities.
Right. So the reknitting requires us to create the conditions in which people come together for a shared purpose, regardless of whether or not they share something in common, right? That's the story of the military, for example. You have to learn to work together to the point where you will lay down your life for somebody. It's also the story of the freshman year of college at institutions that have boarding, which is that you're stuck with this person and you have to find a way to make nice. And in that process, you learn to respect and see difference because it becomes important. So these are examples of like what you want to achieve. Now, how do you get to it? Well, where are the things that we have the greatest need in this country? And this is where you can think of it as a public works project, because we have infrastructure challenges. We've got a climate change challenge. We've got these big grandiose challenges that if we're willing to, invest in financial commitments to actually work on grand challenges, we can do those grand challenges at the same time that we knit together things if we do it strategically. Now, of course, that runs against 40 years of efficiency rhetoric, which we're about dismantling the federalist state. So you're actually coming up with a very clear political commitment and a political contradiction that is part of that challenge. But you can do it as a public works activity. You can also do it in terms of private sector and training issues, right? Which is that many different private sector actors and folks like the military are just like, wow, we have a huge talent gap. And that talent gap comes at every level. That talent gap comes in nursing. That talent gap comes in geriatric care. That talent gap comes within, different aspects of technology. So there's also ways you can imagine investment, and this could be public-private, or it could be just the private if the private could come together and make it a set of moral commitments. There is an investment, and there's ways of designing this is beneficial for a lot of those private sector actors, where the investment in the idea of training is not just for the direct benefit, is not designed just for the direct benefit of their own pipelines, but designed in a way where it's like the purposeful reknitting of people that come together in this project. There's also ways of doing it even down into community and local levels, right? A lot of community governments are running into all sorts of gaps. And there's ways you can imagine this even in smaller forms. These are things we often talk about as fellowships or other structures, where you're purposefully thinking about filling a need within a community, but you're not just designing it to fill that need. You're designing it to connect the people that are part of the group together. And so that's where you start to see certain aspects of the social engineering of this. And let's be clear, that's not new. One of the things that always fascinates me when you talk to people in universities about housing assignment. So for anybody who's listening to this who was like, well, how did I get my freshman roommate, right? It's like, oh, because we both marked smoker or non-smoker. It's like, no, that's not it at all. They're in a lot of the elite institutions, the networks were built through those freshman dorms, and they have long-term legacy effects. The point is that we've seen this stuff happen, but we've never stepped back and done it strategically. And that's the other thing that we have now that we didn't have when a lot of these experiments have been doing. We have whole graph networks. We can see the population. We can see the gaps in the population. People are identifying that, right? They're identifying that, we have gaps across, differences of ideology, difference of experience, difference of race, difference of education. All those gaps can be seen. But the strategic saying of like, hey, what would it mean to bring these people together? What would it mean to invest in these bridging networks? That is something that is possible now, but it requires some coordination. And it goes back to, you're doing a commission. Like these are the kinds of grand challenges that become possible to imagine. And there's different ways to imagine it. There's no one right way. The real question is how to get the will and the might, and then to pair it with the economic structures necessary to do it. And that's one of those where it's like, we're back to grand challenges, which again, as a country, that used to be something we relished.
It is a grand challenge indeed. So just before we close, and you mentioned that this challenge before the commission, is there anything that you think that you haven't talked about that the commission should know or think about as they prioritize both, as they figure out both the priority of issues and then solutions, again, whether it's for government, the private sector, or civil society? What are the most important things to keep in mind, aside from all the other,
no, of
everything
course.
else you laid out?
So most of what I've been laying out is structural. And I think maybe the other component to flip it on its head is to think about what it means for individuals. One of the things that we see repeatedly is that the people who are most most susceptible to the components that we often label as disinformation are often struggling in different ways. They feel alienated and isolated. There's grievance dynamics. They feel confused. They feel left out in different ways. And that's, partially, a dying empire dynamic. That's partially an economic, massive form of inequality. There's a variety of different factors there. But what I would say that the commission should also be thinking about is, if we don't start picking people up as they are really feeling those forms of isolation, the mental health challenges, the economic loss, even the economic instability, the likelihood that they embrace more and more extreme perspectives is high. And once somebody starts down a set of conspiracy ideologies, they will embrace them, they will run them, they will double down on it. And this is not just about youth. People often think this is youth. Elder populations are some of the most susceptible. After spending a year alone at home in COVID, we are in trouble in elder populations, right? Who do not have the connections to broader parts of society. So I think about those moments of how to catch people, how to hold people, how to make them feel whole again. And that to me is, it's a part that I think we've missed in all of this, because the answer is not education. The answer is filling in those human needs, those human connections. And it was one of the places where, for me, paying attention to the internet in the early days, those days of Usenet, it used to be that people would come to the internet and they would cry out for help and people would hold them. It was the thing that made me fall in love with the internet in the 90s. So like, I was a confused kid trying to figure out my sexuality, trying to figure out my identity. And all of these amazing people would sit and hold me, walk me through things, really be powerful. I look at those same lost, confused folks, whether they're kids or older, looking for help online, and what they get is not healthy. So
No.
the other thing for me is at that individual level, how do we build the structures to hold people when they are in a crisis? And that should be top of mind in many ways for right now, because as we leave this pandemic state that we're all in, we are going to be seeing just the degree to which we have a population in different forms of crisis. And to hold them is not to educate, to hold them is to help network them into society, giving them opportunities, giving them meaning, giving them a sense of community. And that is hard work.
Wow. That's a really great point to end on, which is that, when all is said and done, this comes down to the impact on actual individuals and on actual human beings. Man, you've given us a lot to think about. I'm not sure that we've solved it all, but at least we've begun to lay out the landscape of what we need to look at.
I mean, your commission's going to solve it all, right?
Of course, absolutely. What a fantastic! You absolutely delivered on the notion of the foundations of information disorder and mis and disinformation. Danah Boyd, thank you so much. Really appreciate you spending your time with us.
Thank you.